We are in Shviis Perek Vav, and the first two Mishnayos we learned about took us a bit of time for the two Mishnayos to be studied. They deal with the very important subject of Kedusha Shnia, how Shemitah is kept today. Why is it kept today? There's no Beis Hamikdash. We learned the Rambam and the Ravid about Kedusha Rishon and Kedusha Shnia, and we learned the history of the first Beis Hamikdash and the Kedusha ending with the Churban, and then we learned about the second Beis Hamikdash and Bovel and Ezra bringing the Olei Bovel back, and that Kedusha remains, and therefore the halachic sanctity of Eretz Yisrael remains. The question is whether Shemitah is today rabbinic or biblical in its requirement, and that's Machlokas Rambam, who says it's rabbinic, and Ramban Nachmanides, who says it's biblical. And we know now that there are three different parts to quote unquote the borders. There's the part from southern Israel, wherever that may be, that border until Kiziv. Anywhere in between there is Shemitah. So Beit Shemesh, there is Shemitah. It's between the southern border and Kiziv. There is Shemitah. One cannot work his field during Shemitah, and there's also the rules of beer, which Blineda we said we're going to get to through the Rav Rimon Sefer before we break for Pesach. And then there's the second area north of Kiziv until Amana, where Yoshua had conquered that area, but Ezra, when he came back, did not re-sanctify that area a second time, and therefore from Kiziv to Amana, it doesn't have halachic kedusha because Ezra didn't re-sanctify it. Therefore, the Chachamim there said that you cannot work the land in that area from Kiziv north to Amana, but you don't have to keep biur. North of Amana, there is no Shemitah at all. And the map of these places is on page, according to one Shita, page 454 and 456 in the Mishnayos Behira. The next subject we studied yesterday was the rule of Surya, that huge piece of land that's marked on page 456 in the Mishnah Behira. We learned yesterday about Surya. Surya has this quasi status because David conquered it before all of Eretz Yisrael was conquered. And the rule is that a king, after he finishes conquering all of biblical Eretz Yisrael, meaning the 7 nations, he then can go conquer other lands, and the other lands will have the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, halachic Kedusha. But David conquered Surya before finishing conquering the rest of Eretz Yisrael, and therefore it doesn't have the full status of Kedusha Eretz Yisrael. Surya is this quasi place, and we learned yesterday the rules about Surya, what you can do Shemitah in Surya. The Chachamim, the rabbis, impose Shemitah in Surya. They impose certain strictures. They also allowed for certain leniencies that we learned about yesterday. And the reason they imposed certain strictures on Surya is because they didn't want people flocking to Surya. Surya is not full Kedusha Eretz Yisrael, and to make sure Jews did not leave Eretz Yisrael and flock to Surya. Let's go get a cottage in Surya. After all, in Surya, it's kind of holy. David conquered it, so that's okay, but I don't have to keep Shemitah there. So let's go to Surya rather than having to live in Eretz Yisrael. So Chachamim didn't want Yidden leaving to Surya. So they said, we're imposing Shemitah on Surya and certain strictures as if it's Eretz Yisrael. But at the same time, they allowed for leniency so that poor people who needed to collect produce during Shviis, that they would be able to go to Surya to do it instead of having to go to other lands. So we saw yesterday the development of an idea of Chazal, which permeates all of Shas. All of Shas permeates many sugis in Shas. We're going to see more about it today or the next year. Jews need to be in Eretz Yisrael. and where there's a situation that arises that they may be tempted to leave Eretz Yisrael, we, as the Rabbanim, we are going to take away that temptation, and we're going to keep the Jews in Eretz Yisrael. So now we're up to Mishnah Gimel on page 460 in your Mishnayos Behira. B'tzolim shiyordu aleim gishomim v'tzimechu. This is another one of those Mishnayos that deals with a very specific situation. I'm going to go through the Mishnah a bit quickly. Onions, they obviously grow from the ground. Person cuts his onions in the 6th year. What did we learn about vegetables? What year determines the year of a vegetable? The year you pick it. So if I pick, let's use 5 and 6. If I pick vegetables in the 5th year, they are 5th year vegetables. It doesn't make a difference when they blossom. It doesn't make a difference when they popped out of the ground. If I pick it in the 5th year, it's 5th year vegetables from which I give Meiser Rishon to the Levi, and I take some of them, keep the case easy, take some of them to Yerushalayim for Meiser Sheni. If I pick them in the 6th year, then it's Meiser Rishon for the Levi, then it's Meiser Ani for the poor person, no Meiser Sheni. Whereas, remember, by fruits of a tree, it depends upon when it halachically blossomed, chanata. So here we have a case. A person picked onions in the 6th year. What status do those onions have? They're 6 years onion, the 6 year onions. And then this person, in violation of halacha, took the onions and planted them back in the ground in the 7th year. That's the case, the first case the Mishnah is described. Onions that picked in the 6th year, replanted illegally in the ground in the 7th year. Rain came on these onions, and the onions popped out of the ground. They're growing again. Im hoyu ha'olin shalahem shechayrin asurin. If the leaves that are popping out of the ground from these onions are a dark green, that means that it has grown more during Shemitah. And now when you pick those onions, even though 99% of the onion is a 6th year onion, right? Remember, you pick this onion in the 6th year, so it's a 6th year onion. The whole onion is a 6th year onion. You, against halacha, put it back in the ground in the 7th year. Rain, and it's now popping out of the ground. Some leaves, you can see at the bottom of page 461, where it's not really leaves, it's like sproutings that come out from the top of the onion, and they're coming out of the ground now. Now, the real onion is a 6th year onion, but those sprouts are coming out from the ground, and they're a dark green. Dark green sprouts is a sign of a healthy onion. Those dark green sprouts tell you that the onion has grown during the Shemitah year, that the onion has gained minerals, water, etc. during the Shemitah year. It has partially grown during the Shemitah year, and therefore it's completely awesome. Even though could be 95%, 98% of the onion is a 6th year onion, when you put it back in the ground in the 7th year against halacha, and you get these green sprouts, that's telling you that this onion now has sucked from the ground during Shemitah, grown partially during Shemitah. There's no bittul here. We're going to learn about Hilchas bittul, nullification later in the Maseches. Those are very complicated halachas, but for us now, the whole onion is prohibited. However, horiku, if those sprouts that come out are sort of very light yellow, which is telling you that the onion didn't get better, the onion got worse. And those sprouts are turning yellow, and the onion's about to go bad. Then the onions can be eaten. They remain 6-year onions because they didn't grow to any, there's no benefit to those onions by being in the ground during the 7th year. In fact, they're about to ruin. So you can take them out of the ground and you can eat them without any issues of Shemitah. The issue was you planted it in the 7th year. That's a big issue. But can you eat the onion? Yes, you can eat the onion because it's showing signs that it got ruined in the ground, not that it got better in the ground. However, if it actually became green and it became healthy, which means that you planted them illegally during Shemitah, and they got better, the onion got better. And you can see that from the green, dark green sprout on top, then it becomes awesome. Now, what does the word awesome mean? Let's look again at the top of page 461. If those sprouts became a dark green, which means the onion got healthier in the ground during the 7th year, asurin, they are prohibited. What does the word prohibited mean? It can mean two things. Prohibited means you can never eat it altogether because you planted it illegally and now you can never eat it. Or asurin means that you can't eat it as if it were a 6th-year onion, which is what it used to be. You now have to eat it as a 7th-year onion with the sanctity of Shviis. These two are both possible explanations in the Mishnah. So if you take a look, again, top of page 461, if the leaves became a dark green, asurin, they are prohibited. You see, after the word asurin, there's a little dalet in parentheses. That little dalet sends you as a footnote to the top left-hand corner of the page in the Ikar Tosfos Yontif. Dalet asurim mishum gedulei Shviis v'yochlein b'kedusha Shviis. The first interpretation of the Tosfos Yontif is that when it says they are prohibited, it doesn't mean you can never eat it. It means they are prohibited in terms of what they used to be. They used to be 6th-year onions, and it had no sanctity of Shviis, and none of the laws of Shviis applied to it. But once you replanted it illegally, and now it's sprouted out green, so that it demonstrates that the onion got better from the planting in the 6th year. Now that is a 7th-year onion, and it's prohibited to eat it like a regular 6th-year onion. Now you have to eat it with Kedusha Shviis and all the laws of Kedusha Shviis. Inami, the Tosfos Yontif says at the bottom of the left-hand top column, Asurin afilu bachila, we're flipping the page, kedin svichen. Then it's also to eat it, because, or the second shot is, you can never eat it because of that famous din that we've talked about a little, but not fully explained, the rule of svichen. Again, the rule of svichen are things that grow without you doing anything to the field. And this is really the rule of svichen, regulates grain fields and vegetable fields. Trees grow their fruits. They grow, but they don't grow. But they don't grow just as an aftergrowth. When a person has a grain field, he cuts the grain, and as he's cutting the grain, perfectly permissible. He's cutting his grain during the 6th year, or at the end of the 6th year. He's cutting his grain, and as he's gathering the grain, kernels fall all over the ground. And then the wind comes, and it blows it here, and it blows it there. And then some rain comes in Tishrei after Sukkot, and it becomes muddy. And then some more rain comes, and before you know it, it's in Shemitah, and you have grain popping out of your ground. The same thing can happen with vegetables. A person that has a field of onions or some other vegetable, and he picks them at the end of the 6th year. So they're 6th year onions, no problem with that. But as he's picking up all his vegetables, different things drop out, seeds, whatever drops out. And again, we're now in the 7th year. The wind's blowing everything. The rain after Sukkot makes mud. More rain comes, and now there are onions popping out of his ground. He didn't do anything wrong. The grain is popping out because it's growing from kernels that fell during the 6th year. The onions that are popping out, he didn't do anything wrong. They're growing from seeds that dropped out from the onions he picked the 6th year. He didn't do anything wrong. And therefore, because they grew during Shemitah, you should be allowed to eat them. With Kedusha Shviis, right? They grew during Shviis. However, Chazal prohibited Tzvichen, these kind of we call aftergrowths, or these things that grow without you doing anything. We learned about the reason for this. This is again because of the Ovrei Aveira, the sinners. The sinners would secretly, in a hidden way, they would plant their fields during Shemitah, their vegetable fields. They obviously wouldn't fill the whole field because then everybody knows they violated Shemitah. But they would make patches of vegetables here and there. And in their grain fields, they would make patches of wheat or barley here and there. And when people would say, what in the world is growing in your field? How do you have onions growing in your field? You have patches of onions, and in your grain field, you have patches of wheat. And this Over would say, I didn't do anything. It's the aftergrowths from last year. When I cut the field in the 6th year, the seeds dropped down, and now it's popping out of the ground in the 7th year. I didn't do anything wrong. And everybody can come and take, and I'm going to come and take, and we can all enjoy it. So Chazal aser tzvichen, and tzvichen have only regulate vegetables and grain. There's no tzvichen on fruits of a tree. A person can't say that the apples that are growing in my field, the tree wasn't there in the 6th year, and in the 7th year, suddenly there's an apple tree there. If you ask them where the apple tree come from, they'll say, oh, in the 6th year, I dropped the seed, and it took a couple of months, a whole apple tree came. We understand he's a liar, and we understand what he did was he bought a mature apple tree and planted it illegally during Shemitah. We know that. So the issue of these things that grow by themselves is not a topic when you're dealing with trees. It's only a topic when you're dealing with grain and vegetables. The seeds drop. A couple of months later, you have patches of grain or patches of vegetables, and therefore vegetables and grain are prohibited in the 7th year. Okay, Tzvichen. So the person, obviously, if a person intentionally plants in the 7th year, he's got a problem. But even if it's just patches all over the place, some onions there, some carrots there, he's got a patch in his grain field of a little wheat, and another place, another little wheat, and it looks like really he's telling the truth. It's tzvichen. It grew by itself. Tzvichen are aser during Shemitah. So those are the two explanations in the Rav. On page 461, the top of the page, Im hoyu ha'alon shelahem shorin, if the 6th year onion that he impermissibly planted in the 7th year, if the sprouts that come out of the ground are dark green, meaning that it grew in a healthy way from the Shemitah ground, Asurin, they are prohibited to be eaten. Explanation 1, they cannot be eaten in the regular way. They are prohibited from being eaten in the regular way as if they're 6th year onions, which is where they started. They now have Kedusha Shviis, and they have to be eaten as if they were Kedusha Shviis. The second shot is, these are onions. Onions that pop out of a field during Shemitah are tzvichen, and therefore they can't be eaten at all. So this person who took his 6th year onions, put it in the ground impermissibly in the 7th year, he's basically destroyed his ability to eat those onions if they get green. However, horiku, if they got worse, you can see the sprouts are getting yellow, which means they're about to ruin. Harelu mutarim. Then you are permitted to eat those onions. They didn't benefit from the ground in Shemitah. Rabbi Hanina ben Antignas Omer, Rabbi Hanina ben Antignas says, he disagrees. He says, he says the test is not whether. Same case, 6th-year onions picked in the 6th year, planted impermissibly in the 7th year, and now you want to know if when you pull those onions out of the ground, can you eat them? The first opinion of Mishnah said it depends what color those sprouts are. Rabbi Hanina ben Antigna says it doesn't depend upon the color of the sprout. It depends upon whether if you put your hand on the sprout, pictures on page 461, you put your hand on the sprout and you pull it. So if when you pull on the sprouts, the whole onion comes out, what does that tell you about the onion? That tells you that those sprouts that grew are very strong sprouts. Because if those sprouts were weak, when you pulled on the sprouts, they would rip off and the onion would stay in the ground. But if you pull it, the sprouts, and the whole onion comes with it, that means those sprouts are very strong. They are connected to the onion. It's a strong sprout with a strong onion. And again, that's the test. You can't use those onions during Shemitah. One of the two explanations of the Tosfos Yontif. Either you have to eat it with Kedusha Shviis, or you can't eat it at all. But if when you pull the sprouts, the onion remains in the ground, that means the sprouts were not really healthy. They're not really strongly connected to the onion. And then you're permitted to eat the onion, even though you impermissibly planted it in the 7th year after you picked it in the 6th year. Now we have another case. This is an even stranger case. The first case wasn't that strange. Maybe people replant their onions. Here we have a case of a person picked an onion in the 6th year. Okay. He impermissibly plants it in the 7th year. So far, so good. It's the first case. Now, after it grows in the 7th year, he pulls it out of the ground and he replants it again in the 8th year. Now, what do you have? You have a 6th year, it starts as a 6th year onion halachically, because it was picked in the 6th year. He impermissibly plants it in the ground in the 7th year, and it grows. He pulls it out in the 7th year, and he replants it in the 8th year. So now, the Mishnah says, "Ucheneged kein," Rabbi Hanina ben Antigna says, "Ucheneged kein motzoi shvius mutarin." In the 8th year, this would be mutter. What is the chiddush of this halacha? The chiddush of this halacha, this is the opinion of Hanina ben Antignos, and this is not the halacha. This is his opinion. He says the following. Look, in the 6th year, you pick the onion. It's a 6th year onion, has nothing to do with Shviis. You now plant it impermissibly in the 7th year, and it grew to a point where you can prove that it grew well. Even though 95% of that onion, if not more, is a 6th year onion, because it improved and grew more in the 7th year, the 5% that it grew in the 7th year makes the whole onion impermissible. It makes it a Shviis onion, whatever impermissible means. We had the two explanations, Tosfos Yontif. But the little it grew in the 7th year makes the whole onion impermissible. Now, you pull it out of the ground, and you replant in the 8th year. In the 8th year, it grows a little more. So Rabbi Hanina ben Antigna says, now that onion is permitted to be eaten as if it were a regular 8th year onion, a motzoi shmita onion. Why? Because first of all, you have the majority of the onion grew in the 6th year. I then prohibited you from eating the onion, whatever prohibited means, again, according to the Tosfos Yontif. I prohibited you from eating the onion in the 7th year because a minimal amount of the onion is a Shemitah onion. Now you planted it again in the 8th year and more grew. So Rabbi Hanina ben Antignas says as follows. The little that it grew in the 8th year, along with the vast majority that it grew in the 6th year, when you put them together, the little that it grew in the 7th year does not concern me anymore. So while it is true that if you picked it in the 6th year, planted it in the 7th year, and then it grew a little in the 7th year, the sprouts got dark green, or you can pull it out of the ground and the whole onion comes with it, whatever test you're going to use. At that point, the onion is now a 7th year onion, because the little amount that it improved in the 7th year overtakes the whole onion that you picked in the 6th year. Rabbi Hanina ben Antigna says, but if you plant in the 8th year, now you have a little more growth of the 8th year. I will combine that with the vast majority that grew in the 6th year, and this little that grew in the 7th year no longer concerns me, and you can eat it as if it were a regular onion. Okay, that's a unusual case. I don't believe we're going to run into this particular situation where people are going to pull out onions in the 6th year, plant them in the 7th year, pull them out and replant them in the 8th year. But this introduces us now to the idea, which will come up later in the Masechta, very complicated, about bittul, nullification. So if someone has wine that has Kedusha Shviis, and the wine got mixed up with wine that's not Kedusha Shviis, what do you do with that? What do you do with that combination? Is the Kedusha Shviis or not? And those are the laws of bittul nullification. And this basically begins the idea. You have a 6th year onion, it grew a little in the 7th, the whole thing's prohibited, it grew a little more in the 8th. The amount that grew in the 8th combines with the vast majority that grew in the 6th, and they nullify the little that grew in the 7th. So we begin this idea of nullification. Mishnah Dalet. This Mishnah is very relevant for us today. Vegetables pop out of the ground pretty quickly. They're not like you plant a tree and it takes years to see fruit. Vegetables pop out of the ground pretty quickly. You plant them, they come out pretty quickly. Shemitah comes to an end. And the 8th year, what we call the 8th year, but the 8th year is Motzoi Shviis. And the 8th year is really the first year of the next Shemitah cycle. The Mishnah on page 461, Mishnah Dalet says, Me'emasai muta odom lika yerek b'motzoi Shviis. It's Motzoi Shviis, like Motzoi Shabbos. Shabbos is over and we're going into Sunday. Motzoi Shviis means the 7th year is over, we're going into the 8th year. The 8th year also means the first year of the new Shemitah cycle. So it's Rosh Hashanah, and it's the 8th year. Shemitah just ended Shemitah ended 48 hours before, 2 days Rosh Hashanah, Tzayim Gedalia, and Shemitah is now behind us. At what point can I go into the marketplace in Eretz Yisrael and start buying vegetables? How long do I have to wait before I can buy vegetables? Vegetables don't take all that long to grow. So let's say I want to go into the Makolit, or I want to go into a supermarket, and it's a couple of days after Shemitah is over. I want to buy vegetables. Now, fruits create all kinds of problems. We know that because fruits are grown, they're picked, and they're stored. Anybody ever take a trip up north to, I forgot the name of I think it's called Pri HaGalil. But when you take a trip up, you go up north, there are different places that mass produce fruits that are delivered all over the country. So they show you mass stores in certain refrigerators at certain controlled temperatures. They have tens of thousands of apples and tens of thousands of pears. And they have to keep track because they're under Truma and Meiser supervision. They need to keep track of what year is what fruit. Is this 5th year apples? Is it a 6th year apple? And the Rabbanim there are very careful to make sure they know what's going on with this mass storage of fruits. So fruits have their own issue because many fruits halachically blossomed in the 6th year, and they're picked in the 7th year. The fact that they're picked in the 7th year is irrelevant to me. We learned about this. They are not Shemitah fruit. It's not a Shemitah pomegranate because it got picked in the 7th year. If it halachically ripened in the 6th year, you can eat it. And therefore, for months into Shemitah, fruits do not have a major problem. Many fruits begin their problem of Shemitah late in the 7th year or even in the 8th year, because the question is, when did they halachically blossom? So fruits that halachically blossom in the 7th year, that are not picked until the 8th year, those are Shemitah pomegranates because they halachically blossom in the 7th year. So fruits are very complicated, how they store them and how because these things are literally. And then there's the Otzer Beis Din overlaid to this. So fruits are complicated because from the time that they ripen halachically until the time they're picked can be months. Vegetables are not that way. Vegetables grow pretty quickly. And the issue is, when did you pick them? We don't care about when it ripened. When did you pick them? So the Mishnah is now asking, when we're dealing with vegetables, Shemitah is over. It ended a couple of days ago. Shemitah ended 48 hours ago. Today is Tzom Gedalia, 2 days Rosh Hashanah. Shemitah is behind us. I want to go into a store and I want to buy vegetables. Do I still have to worry about Shemitah? Obviously, I have to worry about the issue of the Maseches being taken off and then being done properly. But do I need to still worry about the onions? Maybe they're still Shviis onions. Maybe they got picked during Shviis, because how do you know whether an onion is a 6th-year onion or a 7th-year onion or an 8th-year onion? Well, they got picked. So perhaps the Makolet, Chas v'Sholom, got its onions from a place where they picked onions at the end of the 7th year, so they are Shemitah onions, and they delivered them to the Makolet on Tzom Gedalia. And I'm looking at these onions on Tzom Gedalia 48 hours after Shemitah, and I'm looking at Shemitah onions, and I'm not supposed to be buying them. Okay? So the Mishnah asks the question, when can you start buying vegetables after Shemitah is over? How long do you have to wait and still remain concerned? Mishiyasa keyotzeba. As soon as it creates kiyotzebo. Kiyotzebo means, if you take a look at all the pictures at the bottom of the page, means you go into the makolet. Makolet, let's say we're dealing with onions, we'll continue dealing with onions. The Makolet has onions on Tzom Gedalia. 48 hours after Rosh Hashanah, he got in a fresh delivery of onions. You know, or the industry knows, that an onion of a particular size needs 2 weeks from the time it's planted till the time it can get that big. So you're in the Makolet, and you're in the Makolet, and you see an onion this big. And the industry knows, and you're at Tzom Gedalia. At Tzom Gedalia, you have an onion this big in the Makolet. The industry knows that an onion this big takes 2 weeks for it to get this size from the time it's planted. Well, that means that the onion in the Makolet that's this size is a Shemitah onion. Now, of course, there are onions and vegetables that come into Eretz Yisrael from Chutz La'aretz. We're going to soon, the Mishnah will talk about that. And that's how many of the vegetable issues are taken care of during Shemitah. They import them from Chutz La'aretz. Let's leave Chutz La'aretz out for the time being. Person goes into a makolet and he knows the produce that this makolet owner gets is from Yevul Ha'aretz. It comes from produce of Eretz Yisrael. That's where he gets it from. So it's Som Gedalia, 48 hours after Rosh Hashanah. Shemitah is over 48 hours, and he has an onion this size that you can take. We know that an onion this size takes 2 weeks from the time it's planted till the time it gets to the size, which means that you're looking at an onion that was impermissibly grown, picked, but it's a Shemitah onion because it could not have reached this size in 48 hours. And anyways, who planted it on Rosh Hashanah? So the Mishnah says, Mishiyase kayotzebo. You have to give enough time for the vegetable to have grown to that size. So if the onion that we were talking about takes 2 weeks to grow, right? This onion takes 2 weeks to grow to the size. That means that 2 weeks after Rosh Hashanah, if you see an onion this size in the makolet, you don't have to worry about Shemitah. Meiser is a whole different thing. We all know about Meiser has to be taken care of. But I don't have to worry that I'm looking at a Shemitah onion. This size onion can take takes about 2 weeks to grow. Therefore, 2 or 2.5 weeks after Shemitah is over, I don't have to worry. But it still may be a Shemitah onion. That's the law. That's the halacha. As long as enough time has passed that such a size onion can grow, I am permitted to assume that it grew permissibly in a Jewish field in the 8th year. It got cut and it came to the makolet. Osa habakir, we're flipping now to page 463. Osa habakir hutar he'afil. Very interesting halach. There are places in Eretz Yisrael where vegetables ripen faster than in other places. Okay, so let's take place X. In place X, vegetables. In place X, onions. Okay, let's go back to this. In place X in Eretz Yisrael, onions this size take 2 weeks to grow. In place Z in Eretz Yisrael, onions this size take 4 weeks to grow. And now I'm in the makolet. And I have a question in my mind. Those onions in X take 2 weeks to grow. And in Z take 4 weeks to grow. But it's only 2 weeks after Rosh Hashanah. So how do I know what onions are in front of me here in the makolet? Do these onions originate from place X and they were planted in the 8th year and it took 2 weeks to grow and everything's fine and dandy? Or did this onion come from place Z and it may not be fully ripened, but it came from place Z? So the Mishnah says, and the example I gave you with the 2 4 weeks, not exact, but you can think about it in terms of months, it'll be easier. Asa habakir, if enough time has passed that the quick fields have ripened their vegetables, hutar ha'afil, then even the vegetables that you might think came from the slower areas, they're mutter also. Meaning that when you see in the makolet a vegetable the size that it takes 2 weeks to ripen, that's all it takes, 2 weeks in place X, that's it. Place X tells you that when you go into the makolet, I am permitted to assume it came from place X. And it's grown in place X, it was picked in place X, and therefore it is not Shviis onion. However, if it had come from place Z, how did it get from place Z to this size? Okay, again, it takes 2 weeks for this onion to get to the size from place X. It takes 4 weeks for this onion to get to the size from place X, 2 weeks, place Z, 4 weeks. I'm in the makolet, I see an onion this big 2 weeks after Shemitah is over. So there are 2 possibilities. it came from place X, and therefore it is absolutely permitted 8th year vegetable, onion, or it actually was planted and grown in Shemitah, and now 2 weeks after Shemitah is over, it's right, because it's grown for 4 weeks. But how did it grow for 4 weeks? It's only 2 weeks after Shemitah is over, because it grew 2 weeks during Shemitah. It was planted illegally, grew 2 weeks at the end of Shemitah, the last 2 weeks of the year, and 2 weeks after Shemitah was over. So I got a 4-week onion in front of me, which is prohibited because it's 2 weeks planted and picked during Shemitah. I don't have to think about that. Because place X place X grows such size onions in 2 weeks, I can look in the makolet, buy the onion, and say it came from place X. I don't have to start worrying it came from place Z. That's the halacha. Rebbe Hita Likach Yorak B'Moitzoi Shviis Miyad. Rebbe Yehuda Hanasi, the editor of the Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, Rebbe, he permitted people to buy vegetables immediately after Shemitah is over. Why? Let's take a look in the Rav at the top of the page, on page 463. Rebbe says the day after Rosh Hashanah, obviously you're not buying anything on Rosh Hashanah. Tzom Gedalia, you go into the makolet. There's not an issue about place X and place Z. There's not an issue about how big it is. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says on Tzom Gedalia, walk into the makolet and buy whatever vegetables you want. You don't have to worry about Shemitah at all. Why? Page 463, second line. Moitzoi Shviis Miyad. Lefi shehayu maviim yerek michutz la'aretz. Because in the days of Rebbe, in Eretz Yisrael, they imported a lot of vegetables from Chutz La'aretz. V'hoya rabba al yerek sheberetz Yisrael. And the amount of vegetables that were imported into Eretz Yisrael in the day of Rebbe outnumbered the amount of vegetables that could possibly have been grown in Eretz Yisrael. So even if there were those people who violated Shvita and planted vegetables in the 7th year and picked them in the 7th year, and they're trying to sell them in the 8th year, it's just a small amount. The amount of vegetables that were imported were in greater quantity than those vegetables that were grown impermissibly in Eretz Yisrael. Again, the Rav says, second line, they would bring vegetables from Chutz La'aretz, and it was much greater than the amount of vegetables that had grown in Eretz Yisrael. Now the Rav says, the Rav says, I heard a reason because vegetables within 2 or 3 days, they can actually grow to a normal size where people would buy them. So therefore, when Rebbe says you can buy vegetables immediately after Shemitah is over, he literally means immediately, because within 2-3 days, vegetables grow so quickly. That's the first. That second shot. The first shot is that you literally, on Tzom Gedalia, you buy whatever you want in terms of vegetables, because we may assume that they came from Chutz La'aretz. Now, Rebbe is saying a logic. It's an assumption, because so much is imported from Chutz La'aretz in the day of Rebbe that it way outnumbers the amount that may have been grown impermissibly in the 7th year. Rebbe is telling you about a metzias, a fact. Is that fact still true today? Do we import more than Chas v'Shalom is illegally grown here? That becomes a question. And this is one of the questions in halacha that we're going to deal with. Once Shemitah is over, how long do you have to wait for vegetables? Fruits have a whole different set of laws to them. They're fruits of a tree. And the way we designate Shemitah is when they halachically ripen. So you can go into the makolet 3 months and maybe even more You can go into the Makolet 3 months after Shemitah is over, and you're looking at apples of Shemitah. They halachically ripened in the 7th year. I don't care when they got picked. They got stored in Pri HaGalil for weeks or months, and now they're being released into the general public, and they may be Shemitah Peiros, maybe Otzer based, whatever the case is, but fruits have a completely different issue because of they are designated when they ripen, and between ripening and picking there's a lot of time, in addition to the fact that fruits are stored for a long time. When they hit the market, could be months after they halachically blossom. They present their own problem, and that's how Shemitah really carries into the 8th year. Shemitah carries into the 8th year because of fruits. Vegetables really don't present such a problem. Vegetables grow quickly, and the year of designation is when they are picked. So they don't present that kind of problem as fruits do. Okay, we're going to spend a little more time here so we can finish the perek today and hopefully get to Rav Rimon's halachas of Biur and the halachas of the next 2 mishnahs. And the next 2 mishnahs also deal with that subject that we learned about yesterday and that we reviewed earlier today. Chazal wanting Jews to live in Eretz Yisrael and making rules to ensure that Jews would not leave to Chutz La'aretz even for a trip. I'm not making this up. We're going to read in the Mishnah. Introduction to Mishnah Hay on page 463. Truma that you give to a Kohen that becomes Tomei. Okay. Someone who was Tomei touched the Truma. Or the Truma became Tomei, a dead rat touched the Truma. Whatever the case is, the Truma became Tomei. Once the Truma becomes Tomei, the Kohen can't eat it, he has to burn it. There's a special little quirk in this halacha that deals with oil. Okay. Person gave the Kohen olive oil. Person produced olive oil, and he gives the Kohen his percentage of the olive oil as truma. The Kohen has the olive oil, and the olive oil became tamei. Somebody touched it that was tamei. It came into contact with tumah. The olive oil is tamei. You have to burn it. Done. But here we have a rule. The Kohen is allowed to burn the olive oil in a way that he benefits from it. In other words, when we have grain that you gave to the Kohen that became tamei, he has to burn it. It's tamei. He can't eat it. He can't do anything with it, really. Oil, you can make a fire with oil. So you have to burn the oil because it became truma tamei. But while you're burning it, the Kohen can cook something on that fire. So a Kohen has tamei oil, olive oil as an example, and he has a pot of soup that he wants to cook, and he has logs underneath the pot, and he wants to use the oil to as part of the fire that's going to help him cook his soup. He's allowed to do that. That oil that became, that truma oil that became tamei is called shemen sreifa. It's oil that needs to be burnt, but it has a special rule that while it's being burnt, the Kohen can actually use it for his benefit to cook, for example. Mishnah Hay, page 463. Ein motziin shemen sreifa upeira shviis me'ha'oretz l'chutz la'oretz. One may not remove that tamei truma oil to chutz la'aretz. It must be burnt in Eretz Yisrael. What's the difference? We'll so see in a second. The truma, the tamei truma oil must be burned inside Eretz Yisrael. Peira Shviis, fruits of Shviis that were picked perfectly legally. You went into the field's hefty, you picked some pomegranates. You're not allowed to take them to Chutz La'aretz. We've mentioned this several times. You're not allowed to take them to Chutz La'aretz. And there are different reasons why. One of the reasons is because, again, the mitzvah of biur pops up here. The mitzvah of biur, we learn from a pasuk. We're going to get into the biur, Rav Rimon's biur. We're going to see this. The mitzvah of biur, when that deadline comes that we spoke about last week, and you must take the Shviis that you collected out of your house, that has to be done in Eretz Yisrael. So if you take pomegranates that are Shviis pomegranates and you take them to Chutz La'aretz, we are worried that you won't consume all those peiros before biur. And now you're going to have to do the mitzvah of biur. You're going to have to take them out of your house and rid your house of those pomegranates. The mitzvah of biur can only be done in Eretz Yisrael. Therefore, you can't take peiros Shviis out of Eretz Yisrael at all. Okay. So this comes back to Arthur Jacobs. Remember, I mentioned he sent me a copy of a label on a bottle of wine. It said, made for export after biur, right? So what does that now mean to us? It means a highly technical halachic point. You're not allowed to take peiros Shviis out of Eretz Yisrael. Why? Because you have to do the mitzvah of biur in Eretz Yisrael. And we are worried that if you take the peiros Shviis to Chutz La'aretz, when the biur comes, you will not bring them back to Eretz Yisrael through the biur, and you can't do biur in Chutz La'aretz. But what happens if it's after biur? The biur deadline passed. So, and the biur has been done on these fruits. Can I then take the fruits to Chutz La'aretz? What do I need to be worried about now? I may not do the biur, or I may do the biur in Chutz La'aretz, which I'm not allowed to do. There's nothing to be worried about. The biur was done, and these fruits were taken out of Eretz Yisrael after the biur deadline. So there are shittas like that. So when you see a label and it says X for export after biur, Otzer based in, which is, I think, what the label that Arthur Jacob sent me, that's what it means. It means that the Otzer basin is being somech on the shita, that once the deadline for biur has passed, there's no problem taking peiros Shviis to Chutz La'aretz. If the whole problem of taking peiros Shviis to Chutz La'aretz is because of biur, and you won't be able to do biur in Chutz La'aretz, if the biur has already been done in Eretz Yisrael on those fruits, so you can take them to Chutz La'aretz according to the sheet. So let's take a look. So the same thing is true for Shem and Sreifa. You can't take the oil that became Tomei, the truma oil that became Tomei, you can't take the Chutz La'aretz, because it has to be burnt in Eretz Yisrael. And you can't take the peiros Shviis to Chutz La'aretz because the biur needs to be done in Eretz Yisrael. So if you take a look in the Rav on page 463, the right-hand column on page 463, middle down in the 5 lines from when the Rav becomes narrow, the Rav explains what we just mentioned. V'chein peiros Shviis tzrichem biur ba'aretz. The fruits of Shviis have to have the mitzvah of biur performed in Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, you can't take peiros Shviis to Chutz La'aretz. Again, if it's after the biur, maybe you can. Back to the Mishnah. Amar Reb Shimon said, Shamati b'feirush, I heard clearly, I have a very clear Masorah, Shemotzian l'Surya. Here comes Surya back again, that area we talked about yesterday, that's on the map on page 456 of the Mishnah's Behira. Surya, that quasi-status, David conquered it before the rest of Eretz Yisrael was conquered. Reb Shimon says, I heard clearly, I have a Masorah, that you can take peiros Shviis to Surya. The Eimotzian l'Chutz La'aretz, but you can't take it to Chutz La'aretz. Fine, the halacha is not like Rabbi Shimon. Vav, last mission of the parak. Ein mevi'in truma mechutz la'aretz la'aretz. Now this is going to sound like a very strange halacha, so it needs a little introduction. Basically, the Mishnah says you can't take truma from Chutz La'aretz to Eretz Yisrael. So the obvious question is, what do you mean truma from Chutz La'aretz? Who's taking off truma and Chutz La'aretz? Truma is only Eretz Yisrael. Truma is only in Eretz Yisrael biblically. Rabbinically, there were different countries that Chazal said have to give truma. Mitzrayim, Jews live in Egypt, supposed to be taking off truma. Bavel, Jews live in Bavel, supposed to be taking off truma. And the different reasons why Chazal imposed the laws of truma and Maisa in truma in Bavel, Mitzrayim, and other areas, whatever the reason. So there's a din of truma. Let's use Egypt as our example. Jews live in Mitzrayim. They need to make sure that their truma is being taken off. Now, you have a Jew that lives in Mitzrayim, and he needs to take off his truma. So he takes off truma. Now, what should he do with that truma? He's not allowed to take that truma to Eretz Yisrael. He has to find a kohen who lives in Mitzrayim and give him the truma. But he can't take it to Eretz Yisrael to give it to a kohen in Eretz Yisrael. Why? Mishnah Vav. Ein maviin truma mechutz la'aretz la'aretz. You're not allowed to take truma, in our example, from Mitzrayim, that rabbinic truma. You cannot bring it into Eretz Yisrael. Rav, left side of the page. Vav. Ein maviin truma mechutz la'aretz la'aretz Yisrael. L'fi she'hatruma kohanim machazrin acharei lebeis hagranos. Kohanim are allowed to travel all over and collect their truma. They knock on your door, and this is not like a korban where you bring the korban to the base hamikdash, and then the kohen gets a portion of it. Remember, we learned Midas. We learned Maseches Tamid. We learned about the Mishmarais. Every week there was a different Mishmar, and every day there was different Beis Av. So they split up the korbanos through the Mishmar and through the Beis Av. Be that as it may, that's how korbanos are brought, and that's how the Kohanim got their meat. Truma, the Kohanim generally would walk around and they knock on people's doors. Do you have any truma that you need to give? Would you please give it to me? They would be machzer ala gwalos. They would go from farm to farm and say, you have any truma you need to give away? Would you please give it to me? Okay. So now, Chayshi Rabbanon, I'm reading from the Rav, right? Again, I emphasize, Lublin's not making anything up here. This is the Rav, this comes from the Gemara. Chayshi Rabbanon, Chachamim were worried. Shemiyu hakohanim meratem acharecha, v'yetzu chutz la'aretz la'aretz hatruma. If you're allowed to bring truma from Mitzrayim, that rabbinic truma, you're allowed to take that truma and bring it to Eretz Yisrael, what's going to end up happening? The Kohanim who live in Eretz Yisrael, they're going to travel to Mitzrayim. And they're going to start knocking on the doors of the Jews who live in Mitzrayim and say, by the way, do you have any extra truma? Oh, yeah, great. Can you give it to me? And then he would put it in his knapsack. He'd go back to Eretz Yisrael. And now we don't have truma. So now it's profitable to go collect in Mitzrayim. The Kohanim will end up leaving Eretz Yisrael temporarily. They're going to leave Eretz Yisrael temporarily. They're going to go and knock on people's doors in Mitzrayim. They're going to knock on the doors of Jewish people in Mitzrayim and say, do you have any extra truma? Great. And now he will go back to Eretz Yisrael. We don't want him to leave Eretz Yisrael to go collect truma. So the law became, the Chachamim imposed the rule that the truma, the rabbinic truma that you take off in Mitzrayim, is not to be taken back to Eretz Yisrael. So now you have Yekoyed from Beit Shemesh, and he's going to make a long trip to Mitzrayim to collect some truma. He collects the truma, and he can eat it in Mitzrayim. But he can't bring it back to Eretz Yisrael. He's not allowed to bring back the truma to Eretz Yisrael. So he went through that whole bother to trek down to Mitzrayim, trek back up to Eretz Yisrael, and in the process, he can get a little truma that he can eat in Mitzrayim. but he's not bringing anything back for his family because Truma of Chutz La'aretz cannot be brought back to Eretz Yisrael, so that Kohanim will not walk out of Eretz Yisrael for a profitable reason, such as collecting Truma. There's a little quirk here that we're not going to go in today. And if you take a look at the last line of the Rab says, the Chachamim didn't want Kohanim to leave Eretz Yisrael, Lahavi is Hatruma, and there's a little Zion there, and that Zion goes to the left-hand corner of the Tosfos Yontif, V'yitamu. He adds the word V'yitamu. And that's a whole sugi in itself. We spoke about it many weeks ago in Pasha. Chazal were geyser that Chutz La'aretz is Tameh. It's ritually impure, and there are different reasons for that, but all of Chutz La'aretz is ritually impure. So besides the Kohen not leaving Eretz Yisrael, generally, we don't want any Jews leaving Eretz Yisrael, and therefore Kohanim who go to Chutz La'aretz to collect Truma, they go to Mitzrayim, they can't come back with that Truma. They cannot come back with that Truma. So it's not even profitable for them to go and collect it to begin with. So that's one reason. We don't want Kohanim to leave Eretz Yisrael. We don't want any Jews to leave Eretz Yisrael, but there's a special rule made for Kohanim. And there's an overlay to this as well, that a Kohen should not leave Eretz Yisrael altogether, because if he leaves Eretz Yisrael, he becomes ritually impure, and a Kohen should not be ritually impure. It should be Tahor. And a Kohen who leaves Eretz Yisrael to go to Chutz La'aretz, he is going to a place of Tum. What does that mean for Kohanim today? What does that mean for Kohanim today? This is a very interesting shaila. So many people say, what's the big deal if a Kohen goes to Chutz La'aretz? Chutz La'aretz is Tameh. Chazal said it's ritually impure and a Kohen can't go there, but what's the big deal? Everyone's ritually impure anyways today. Whether it's Tamei Mace or whatever it is, everyone's ritually impure today. So we're ritually impure even on a biblical level. So if a Kohen wants to go to Chutz La'aretz, the impurity in Chutz La'aretz is of rabbinic nature. So if a person is already biblically impure, what's the problem to go to Chutz La'aretz and add a little more impurity, or a little more rabbinic impurity? That's not simple. That's called Moisef Tuma al Tumasoi. And Chazal have a famous mashal about this. Misha achal shum yachsav yoichal shum. If someone ate garlic and he has bad breath, and people don't want to talk to him, the solution for this person is not to eat more garlic. You don't solve a problem by making the problem even bigger. If you have a garlic bad breath, you don't go back and eat more garlic to get rid of the garlic bad breath. So here you have a person, he says to himself, look, I'm already biblically impure. So I go to Chutz La'aretz, I become rabbinically impure. It's a little more impurity. All right, so what's the big deal? It's a big deal. There's a big shaila about Moisef Tum al Tumasoi. The Rambam clearly holds that you're not allowed to be Moisef Tum al Tuma. And besides that, it's every second that a person is in Chutz La'aretz, he's in Tumah. It's not like he came into contact with a sheretz and now he's Tameh because of that momentary touching of the dead rat. Momentary touching the dead rat leads to Tumah. When you're in Chutz La'aretz, every second there is like coming into contact with a rat is a biblical tumah, sheretz. But it's one contact that leads to tumah. When you're in Chutz La'aretz, every second there, it would be analogous to touching a sheretz every second. Although sheretz is biblical and Chutz La'aretz is rabbinic, I'm just using it as an analogy. A person comes into contact with a sheretz, he became tameh. A person in Chutz La'aretz, every second he's sitting inside the ritual impurity. And why is it ritually impure? There's a whole sugi about why they made it ritually impure. And we learned about this many weeks ago about a Nazir who said, I accept upon myself Nazirus in Chutz La'aretz, and a Nazir is not allowed to become tameh. So how does he become a Nazir in Chutz La'aretz? We talked about that. Nazir daf yud tes amud beis, machlekes beis Shammai beis Hillel. At any rate, Chazal made a rule. The truma, the rabbinic truma that has to be taken off in Mitzrayim, for example, a Kohen could go trek down there from Eretz Yisrael and get some, but it's not very profitable because he's not allowed to bring any of it back to Eretz Yisrael, so this way he'll not leave Eretz Yisrael to begin with. Last line of the Mishnah, Amar Reb Shimon says, Shamati b'feirish shemaviyim mesuri v'enviyim l'chutz l'oretz. Reb Shimon again, as Reb Shimon in the last Mishnah, Reb Shimon says, I heard, have a Messiah, that you're allowed to bring truma from Syria. The Jews in Syria rabbinically had to keep truma, and from there you can bring truma to Eretz Yisrael. But you can't bring truma from chutz l'oretz. So we see from the last Mishnah, Reb Shimon said that you can take Peirish Shviis to Syria, and here he says you can bring truma from Syria to Eretz Yisrael. We see that Reb Shimon's shita is that Syria is not really quasi Eretz Yisrael. Reb Shimon gives Syria a much more halachic status of Eretz Yisrael, to the point that you can take fruits of Shviis to Syria, and from Syria you can bring truma into Eretz Yisrael. The halacha is not like Rabbi Shimon. You cannot take Peirish Shviis to Syria, and you can't bring truma from Syria into Eretz Yisrael. That concludes Perek Vav. So we have numerous issues in Perek Vav, which we're going to go, B'lineh, the next time we learn Shvius, we're going to go into Rav Rimon Sefer. First of all, we have the issue of where do you have to keep Shemitah today? We keep Shemitah today only in the area re-sanctified, the second re-sanctification by Ezra and the Olei Bavel, from the southern border, wherever that may be, until Kiziv, wherever that may be. In between those 2 points, Shemitah must be kept. You cannot work the field, and you have to do the mitzvah of Biur. Is Shemitah rabbinic or biblical today? Maimonides, rabbinic; Nachmanides, biblical. That's the first issue. Where are these places? If you go further north from Kiziv to Amana, you can't work the field, but there's no mitzvah of Biur. Where is that place? What is the mitzvah of Biur? And what is the prohibition of taking fruits of Shemitah to Eretz Yisrael? We learned the Rav that it's intertwined with Biur. You can't take the Peirish of Shemitah to Chutz La'aretz because you need to do Biur in Eretz Yisrael, and you may end up with Peirish Shvius and Chutz La'aretz at the time of Biur, and you can't do Biur in Chutz La'aretz. So the laws of Biur intertwined with not taking fruits of Eretz Shemitah fruits to Chutz La'aretz. So we're going to take a look at Rav Ramon about perhaps the borders. We'll see how we do that. It's a very complicated issue. But we're going to read from Rav Ramon about the Biur mitzvah. What does it mean? How do you do it? What's this calendar? What's the schedule? And taking fruits of Shvius to Chutz La'aretz. Shouldn't have such shilas that we need to go to Chutz La'aretz with Peirish Shvius, but sometimes the shilah comes up. Is there a prohibition today? At what point is there a possibility that a person can take Shemitah fruit to Chutz La'aretz? And this will become a problem for esrogim. People love in Chutz La'aretz to buy esrogim that grew in Eretz Yisrael. So this will become a problem. It's not a problem coming up. But why isn't it a problem? Sukkos haboleinu l'toiva in Mashiach ben David. The sukkahs that's coming to us, the esrogim we're going to buy in the shuk, halachically ripened well, although esrog is a complicated quasi status. But when did the esrog really halachically ripen? If you're selling at sukkahs, it got halachically ripened in the 6th year, this year. At the end of this year, the esrogim got picked. At the end of this year, the esrogim halachically ripened. It's a fruit. We don't care when you pick it. It halachically ripened and halachically blossom. And the esrogim we're going to be buying next year, haboleinu l'toiva sukkos, have no shaila of Shemitah. When is there going to be a shaila of Shemitah Esrogim? In the 8th year, because the 8th year Esrogim, Sukkot 8th year, are Esrogim that halachically blossomed during the 7th year. So the Shemitah Esrogim will be halachically blossomed in the 7th year. They will be picked maybe in the 7th year or maybe early in the 8th year. But the esrogim that are sold in the 8th year will be Shemitah esrogim. That's when the problem comes up. So now, are you allowed to export those esrogim in the 8th year because they are 7th year esrogim, they're Shemitah esrogim? Can you export them outside? Can you send esrogim of Eretz Yisrael in the 8th year to Chutz La'aretz? Is it possible? Can it be done? How would you do biur? These are all shilas that come up and are dealt with in the halacha. The next time we learn Shviis, please have your Rav Ramon Sefer, because we'll be reading the halachas that we just spoke about.